Hi everyone! Today I'm going to be talking about my project researching nationalist ideologies in Catalunya, a region of Spain that is currently waging a pretty contentious fight for independence. So just to give you guys a little bit of context, I spent a few months conducting interviews and doing field work in Catalunya, the region highlighted in red here. It's actually where my dad's family's from, so I was able to stay with them and interview a few family members for the project. I set out to answer three basic questions in the beginning. First, who are the independentistas? If you're wondering the same thing, an independentista is someone fighting for independence from Spain and Catalunya. Then, what do they stand for and why have they been so successful? When I say successful, I mean that their fight remains politically legitimate and they have a strong national platform. I used Richard Handler's Nationalism and the Politics of Culture in Quebec as a basis for my analytical framework. I think this quote really gets at the crux of the phenomenon of nationalism. He says nationalism is an ideology in which social reality, conceived in terms of nationhood, is endowed with the reality of natural things. So here the nation becomes an asocial, ahistoric landmass that exists outside of relationships between people and groups of people. I want to highlight this quote from an interview that I found really striking. She says, Spain doesn't seem to really admit native plurality. I mean, if you have millions of immigrants from millions of parts of the world, you can't just change your identity. So here, multiple different immigrant identities don't constitute a nation, but a few consolidated native identities do constitute a nation. We have a really insider versus outsider nationalist discourse here. But this begs the question, what does constitute or index the Catalan identity? In other words, what behavior or set of behaviors magically makes someone into a quote-unquote Catalan? At the risk of oversimplifying, I found that to speak Catalan is to be Catalan. Or in other words, you can't be Catalan unless you speak the language. So, what's interesting is that Catalan nationalism actually goes further and they adopt the narrative of a colonized nation. So here we have a quote from one of my interviews. She says, "It's kind of been like the Bourbons marched into a territory and we have been their colony ever since." So just to give you a quick crash course in Spanish history, so we know what's going on here. It used to be divided into the Crown of Castilla and the Crown of Aragon. They united in the 1400s when these two dudes got married. The King of Catalunya split the Kingdom of Aragon with the King of Aragon, so it was pretty much half and half. And Catalan was actually the official language of the region of Aragon until its downfall in the 1700s. What happened in the 1700s is that the King of Spain declared some random French ancestor of his successor. The Crown of Aragon was unhappy and they fought a war for 13 years. Aragon lost, and so, Catalunya lost as well. And the results of this war kind of are the basis of a lot of the colonized sentiment in my interviews, as well as the 40-year dictatorship of Francisco Franco that ended in 1975. So here we have another quote. I asked this woman how long she had been an independentista, and she said, basically she was born into it. My first memories are during the Franco era. My family has been anti-Spanish our whole lives, anti-colonialism. I say this because we consider ourselves a colony. It's telling that Spain's colonial conquest of the Americas and Northern Africa never really comes up in my interviews. In fact, Spain actually still occupies 2 cities in Morocco to this day. However, the independentistas aren't aligning themselves with other nations that have been colonized by Spain, but they are using anti-colonist narratives in their discourse, which creates a little bit of dissonance here. So this brings us to language. You can't really talk about Catalunya without talking about Catalan, which is their language. Following Franco's death in 1975, Spain experienced a period of reconstruction wherein they basically had to conjure up a democracy out of thin air. There are still some holdovers from Franco's reign in that democracy, but during the period of the late 70s and early 80s, Catalan leaders found themselves at a crossroads. I used Catherine A. Woolard's singular and plural ideologies of linguistic authority in 21st century Catalunya as a basis for much of my linguistic analysis. And here she says, could Catalan make the leap from tenacious minoritized language to secure public language? And if so, how? She's really creating a binary. Either you are a tenacious and minoritized, or you're secure and public. But how do languages like Spanish, for example, become secure and public? Through global projects of colonization. So again, we're seeing this dissonance between the narrative of the colonized and the narrative of the colonizer. I also want to push back against the idea that Catalan is a minoritized language. As you can see in the chart here, upon Franco's death, about 50% of Catalans spoke Catalan. These were largely upper-class people who had been carrying along the use of Catalan since the 13 Years' War of the early 1700s. But today, more than 90% of people speak or understand Catalan. So how did this happen? In their effort to make the leap between two static linguistic conditions, tenacious and minoritized, to secure and public, Catalan leaders undertook a project of language naturalization, which entailed extensive bilingual educational policy rollouts. Also, this harkens back to Handler's definition of nationalism as the constitution of social phenomena as natural phenomena. So here, the Catalan language becomes a natural state. If you look at this language landscape regionally rather than globally, Spanish is actually a working class migrant language following Franco's death because people had fled to the region looking for jobs during a period of tremendous austerity because Catalunya was actually one of the only places where you could find a job. If we go back to the beginning, where I asked myself why have they been so successful, in fact, the project of Catalan naturalization was not the struggle of a poor working class language to rise through the ranks of a stratified society and become its official language, but rather it was the trickle-down implementation of an entrenched regional language to the working class. So this is not a bottom-up implementation, it's really a top-down implementation, which probably speaks to their success. I want to finish up by highlighting Basque nationalism, which was often referred to as a failed experiment preceding Catalan independence during my interviews. The Basque Country is the little green region next to Catalunya, which is red. Basque independence was a political movement that transformed into a domestic terrorism organization called ETA during Franco's reign in the 60s and 70s. But it had the same foundation as today's Catalan Independence Movement. They were both based on ideologies of language, freedom, and democracy. If we look at possible causes for this difference in tactic, ETA was formed during an oppressive dictatorship, while Catalan independence, which is more peaceful, largely blossomed following Franco's death. Here I have some quotes from ETA's leader. He said, biological analyses proved that specific Cro-Magnon traits had survived only among the Basques. This was also in a time before there was enough science around to debunk what he was saying. He also said, if ethnically speaking any nation truly exists in Europe, then it is the Basque nation. So these are almost the perfect example of nationalism at its extreme, where the nation is genetic or biological and somehow exists as a result of natural processes that take place within its members. So I actually love this graphic. If you can't read it, it says, tourists remember, you are not in Spain or in France, you are in the Basque Country, the oldest nation in Europe, which is just a great representation of nationalist naturalism in image form. Obviously, I've been pretty critical of the Catalan Independence Movement, and I'm pretty sure I'd get excommunicated if anyone from my family ever actually read it. But I'm so grateful for having had the opportunity to connect with my family through my research last summer. I want to just take a moment to thank everyone who supported me during this long, sometimes harrowing journey, especially Professor Durrani and my thesis classmates. Congratulations to everyone, and thank you for listening.